Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I welcome you here to the Royal Society? My name is Paul Nurse. I'm President of the Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here and all of the judges, and as we shall see a little later, the authors too. This is, for me, I think one of the highlights of the Royal Society's calendar, this particular event, and I'm very pleased. It's the first time I'm doing it as President, and I'm very pleased to be here. Now, it is being webcast and recorded, just so you know that, and it would be helpful if you switch your mobile phones off, if I can remind you to do that. Let me start with a few words about the Royal Society. It's essentially the National Academy for Science for the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, but it has its spread throughout the world. It's a fellowship of the world's most eminent scientists and is the oldest scientific academy in continuous existence in the world. And of course, we like age, and that's something that we're very proud of. And indeed, many would say that the Royal Society in the late 17th century contributed a great deal to the invention of modern science. And I use the word invention of modern science. It crystallized it into something closer to the activity that we know today. Our objective is to expand the frontiers of knowledge, to champion the development and use of science, mathematics and engineering and medicine for the benefit of humanity in its widest sense, for the good of society, to drive economic growth, to improve the lot of humankind, and also to contribute to the culture and civilization. And I really see the society should be playing an important role in positioning science at the centre of our culture and our civilization. And this book prize is part of that. It contributes to that. Now, the Royal Society Winton Prize for science books celebrates the very best in popular science writing. It was originally established in 1988, and its intention is to encourage the writing, publishing and reading of good and accessible popular science books. And they have grown to become one of the UK's most prestigious non-fiction literary prizes. This prize is supported by Winton Capital Management, and we're extremely grateful for their support for 5 years for this particular prize. Now, I have never written a book, and frankly, when I see books with all those sentences with verbs in them, it really, frankly, totally impresses me. So I look with admiration upon the authors, because they have written often hundreds of pages with sentences all with a verb in. At least I hope they had verbs in, but that's we can perhaps ask our jury later. But I have read a great deal of science writing because I'm interested in all aspects of science, but only expert in a part of it, and I like to be exposed to all aspects of science. And I want to share with you what excitement I have when a good science book gets out on something I don't really know very much about. I grab it, I read it, and it gives me huge satisfaction, and I know it does to many, many others. So it's a very good activity to be writing popular science, not only because it's exciting to read, but because science communication is so very important. Because the way I like to put this is that that because of our increasingly complex society and the role that science and technology has in that society, if we are going to have a healthy democracy, we have to make informed decisions and choices which are relevant to science and for which science itself has relevance. And if we cannot manage that quite complicated issue of how we fold in science into decision making, we will not make good decisions, and our democracy will suffer as a consequence. So not only are popular science books and other ways of media communication just very pleasurable, but I would actually say they are crucial for the proper running of our society and will be increasingly the case. Now, it's my real pleasure, before I hand over to the judges, to invite David Harding, who's the chairman of Winton Capital Management, to say a few words. And I want to say, before I get away from these microphones, that it's David's passion for this prize that we have this support. And on behalf of the society, David, I want to just say how delighted we are that you are supporting it. So thank you very, very much for that. And I think we should appreciate that. David.
Thank you very much, Paul. All I've got to say really is that, when I read a good popular science book such as these books, I just end up, at the end of reading that book, I end up thinking how lucky I am to be alive right now in 2011 at this moment in history when so much, the questions that have troubled men and women for the whole of our history, so much is being done to elucidate those questions in so many different fields, and people like these people make that knowledge, which is being created all over the world by public and private sectors working together, creating magnificent things like the knowledge machine of Google, the super collider, the advances in genetics and linguistics. All of these miraculous and wonderful truths can be revealed to any of us, whatever job we have, through reading these kind of books. And therefore, the work that these guys do is a wonderful thing for the world, I think. And the fact that we're able to, make a little bit of a contribution towards encouraging more good science books to be written, and those that are written to sell more copies, hopefully, and earn a better living for the people that produce them. The fact that we can make a little bit of a contribution to that, whilst associating ourselves, with the institution of the Royal Society and associating ourselves with these wonderful things, it's a privilege and an honour for us. And thank you to all those people for allowing us to be associated in that way, and also thank you to the judges for reading 135 books each.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear I'm soon going off the stage, but I have one last task, which is to introduce Richard Holmes, who's the chair of judges. Richard, I know, will be very familiar to many of you. He is a fellow of both the Royal Society of Literature and the British Academy, and he's the author of numerous biographies, most of which I've read, I have to say, on Shelley, Johnson and Coleridge, for example. And I have a real passion for the Romantic poets, so I have to say I'm on top of that. He's written books about the biographer's art, but his main connection to science, though you could see echoes of that in some of his earlier work, was in 2008 with The Age of Wonder, how the Romantic generation discovered the beauty and terror of science. And I remember reading this. I was living and working in New York, and it just knocked my socks off, actually. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I've borrowed and stolen from it ever since, actually. And I want to thank Richard for that. It, of course, won the 2009 Royal Society Prize for Science Books. And I'm so pleased that Richard has agreed to chair the jury for this particular prize. So perhaps I could now hand over to Richard. If we could welcome Richard Holmes. Thank
you. Well, thank you, Paul, for that very handsome introduction. I have to say immediately, I haven't been referred to as the chair. I've been referred to as the deck chair. And none of my fellow panel members seem to have disagreed with this, and you may see why. The Winton Prize for Science. A time of bad economic indicators, let me tell you one thing. I was looking at the statistics, and the last 3 years, book sales have held fairly steady, but popular science sales have gone up point by point each of the last 3 years, which we need to inform our Prime Minister of this fact, I think. Format of the evening. I will be introducing the panel fellow judges. We'll then hear readings from each author. And I want to say, on behalf of the panel, that we're tremendously grateful to the authors for doing this, because it is actually quite a testing moment to do this, to have to read from your own book this moment. And we really appreciate you doing that. And I can say personally, I know what the experience is like. Right? So thank you. And we are looking forward to that. And the main object of this is to put attention on all the 6 shortlist books. 130 plus books. They arrived in April. We'll talk a little bit about this. Don't do the maths. 130 books arriving in April. Don't do the maths. I have to tell you, there was a preliminary period when it's very clear, and this is relevant, that what we were getting books which were actually academic books or textbooks or coffee books or boffinology books or what I call nerd lit books. All right? None of those are popular science. Popular science, which I passionately feel, and I completely agree with Paul Nurse about this, it's such an important form, and that is why this prize is important. My definition, or one of them, might be that it's a challenge to turn a long, complicated equation into a clear sentence with verbs. That might be one definition. One more thing, this is addressed also to the shortlist authors. In a way, I think this prize is defined by its shortlist. If you go back, I think you may have this in the document, or at least you can check it on the internet. It is amazing when you go back from 1988 onwards, if you look at the shortlist authors. Here's a few I plucked out. And remember, a lot of them were not well known at the time they were shortlisted for this prize. And it runs like this. This is just a few of them. Stephen Hawking, John Gribbin, John Penrose, Roger Penrose, David Attenborough, Paul Davis, Matt Ridley, Steve Jones, Arthur Clarke, Stephen Pinker, Richard Dawkins, Dava Sabal, Richard Fortey, Simon Singh, Lewis Wolpert, Jared Diamond, Bill Bryson, Robert Winston, Philip Ball, Ian Stewart, Manjit Kumar, Brian Cox, Ben Goldacre. Stop. I think I made the point. All right. Just one more moment before I introduce our lovely panel. It might be of interest. Here are some of the subjects, why we were in discussion. And it was I found it a fascinating process. I've been on a few panels, literary panels in my time. This, to me, was the most educational panel and most interesting. And I speak as a person who's been on a panel with Dame Beryl Bainbridge. But this really was fascinating. There are very good guidelines of the Society stressing that we're looking for stimulating, engaging, clear and accessible writing, whether by a scientist, professional scientific writer, journalist or non-journalist. That's very important. It's a very broad scope there for who might possibly write these books. And it is a real art, writing a popular science book. It is difficult. And if you've come through from a list of 130 plus, you can be very thrilled, in my view. One of the things we noticed, quickly reading this off, is amazingly varied the way you can approach popular science. You can use all kinds of forms of the personal memoir, the biography or the nuggets of biography, travelogue, interviews, even thriller or detective forms of story writing. And all those, incidentally, were used by our 6 shortlisted authors differently, in different ways. And it's one of the reasons we chose them, because they were so good and original in the way they attacked the form of the book. Second point, correct science. Often not mentioned this. We were worried sometimes about whether the science was good science. And here's the thing that's in the terms of the prize, where we are worried about a piece of science, we can consult with fellows of the Royal Society. And I may tell you we did that on 3 occasions. But just specific, not the whole book. You just say, this piece of science, we had reports on it. And I may say those 3 books are not among the shortlist. All right? But that's very important, how correct is the science. And we were looking all the time also for a book that would demonstrate the scientific method. How does the scientific mind work? What is the scientific method? We were very conscious of the question of specialization. Science is more and more specialized, and indeed we, the panel, have our own particular specialities. So we're looking for books that bridge out from particular specializations. We were interested in the pictures, photos, diagrams, which all but one book have in the shortlist, how those are used. They can be very, very helpful. We were very interested in the use of humor. Interesting, I have a sort of theory about this, that this almost began with Bill Bryson's book, a particular way of telling a story where you, as it were, break the tension of the argument with a particular kind of humor, all right? And there are various ways of doing that. It's risky, but when it works, it's very, very effective because it not only disarms the reader, but in a curious way, it improves the attention. Because you have that little moment where you pull back that joke, and then your attention is back on. It's, for literary terms, it's called the knocking at the gate in Macbeth. It's that principle. But all the books, in their own way, used humor, and we very much like that. A couple of final points. We talked briefly about the presentation of science books. Not too much. Covers, quotations. I have to say, I wonder if it's helpful to have on your cover the following quotation, jaw-droppingly wonderful Stephen Fry. I do raise that question. I also hasten to say it had no effect on our judgment one way or the other. Fatal words in the panel, this book is stodgy, this book is biased, or this book is fluffy at the edges. All right. Finally, this. We came out with a sort of big idea from our judging, which we think is, of course, popular science books. They're books of discovery, they're books of wonder, they're books of education. But in a way, the thing, and we discussed this a lot, they're books, we want books that took us out of our depth in a certain way, took us out of our depths, opened a world up to us, and then, most important, brought us back again, brought us back, didn't leave us puzzled or not understanding. So to take you out of your depth and be brought back again, possibly transformed. So that very short. Let me now introduce the panel and we'll have a quick discussion. I have to say I was privileged. You don't know that, do you? I was really privileged to work with you. And I've also done, being a biographer, I've done a little research into your own backgrounds, rather more than appears. Jenny Clack. Jenny here. First seat there on your left as you face. She is a fellow of the Royal Society, which is wonderful to have on the panel. She is professor of vertebrate paleontology at Cambridge and also curator of the museum there of paleontology and zoology. Her field is, as far as I can understand it, is evolutionary biology, and particularly that period, I think it's possibly called the Devonian, when fishes begin to emerge from that primeval slime and take on legs. They become tetrapods. And she published a wonderful book about this called Gaining Ground. She didn't know I knew this, I do. And it won a wonderful medal from the National Academy of Sciences, Gaining Ground. And I also read a learned paper about her work, which ended up, it said, Professor Clack has given a new meaning to the term fish fingers. Next, Kate McPhee over there, who was born in Melbourne, has been a Royal Society University Research Fellow, and is now a very distinguished professor of biological physics at the University of Edinburgh. And she's flown down each time, zoomed down from Edinburgh, even today, I think. Must be so much warmer down here. Her special field of research is protein self-assembly. And I looked into this bit. I began to understand a little about it. It's when, what she's interested in is when a protein assembly goes wrong and when it goes right. And her list of special papers, I printed out 3 pages of list of her special papers on this subject. But also, she has other special interests. One is astrobiology, and the other is women in science. She writes very well about this and quite combatively, and I think that's absolutely right, and I'm with you on this. And in general, the origins of life. And I have to tell you, there's one particularly fraught moment, well, not really fraught, in our discussion, when she whipped out her iPad, held it over her head and said, this app shows you all the stars above your head. So we looked at it. And then the punchline, she then turned it over and she said, and those are all the stars above Australia. We felt much better after that. Okay. So wonderful working with her. And finally, Robert Llewellyn, a man of many parts, I've written down here. Writer, actor, sometime comedian, distinguished TV presenter of popular science and technology programs like, and I've listed one, Machine of the Week, Carpool, several books, rather striking titles, Punch Bag, Scrap Heap, The Man in the Rubber Mask. And why for all this? Because, and this is where you'll know him, of course, is for his role as Crichton, who is that wonderful humanoid. Is he a robot or is he a humanoid? Mechanoid. In Red Dwarf, which is a new series is about to come out. So, and he, as our media star, will be introducing our authors in a moment. I also, don't know if he wants me to say this, I happen to know that he was on Celebrity Mastermind, and his subject, his special subject, was electric cars. Good, I thought, good. I don't know if you won or not. I'm not sure. You didn't, okay. So he will be presenting in a moment our shortlist of authors. I hope not entirely in the character of Crichton. Okay, let's get that. So, as Dave Dimble says, let's welcome our panel. Okay.
Well done.
Now, just a few questions so you get the feel of this. Somebody asked me to ask this question: what was the scariest thing about the panel? And I thought that's the scariest question you could possibly ask, really. So I want to ask this quite innocent question. What did you each do when the door flew open and 130-plus books arrived on your doorstep? Kate, what did you do?
Fling the boxes open and search through them like Christmas. It was fantastic.
That's very good. Did you have an organising principle?
Absolutely none.
No,
Nope.
Just as they came.
Yep.
What about you, Jenny?
Excuse me. I actually stacked them up on the table in subject areas, so that I had a reasonable grasp of what were the most popular subjects that had come up this year, which was quite an interesting thought. And then gradually worked my way through each pile.
An evolutionary principle immediately, yes. Robert?
Just overwhelmed. I mean, it is. I've only just learned, because I wish I'd done either of those things. I just was so overwhelmed that I just opened the first box. I don't think I actually cried, but it was very close. You know, and I just went, because I thought, would you read for the science? And I thought a dozen, maybe 20 books. Yeah. I just had no idea. Yeah. So it was. I was utterly overwhelmed, and until I met the rest of you, I just thought, I can't do this. I don't even know how to start. You know? So it was, overwhelming.
Yes, good. Well, I think we all felt that to some degree, and it's one wonderful thing about email. Right through the summer, we were exchanging emails. Even when we were meant to be on holiday, there was this continual background hum of prize books, which actually was wonderful. Specialist knowledge. I wanted to ask each of you that, because each of you have a specialism in your own way. How much did that help or hinder? Because it's one of the great challenges of popular science, isn't it, is to break out. Did your own special field affect the way you read books?
I was quite conscious to make sure that I wasn't biasing the books that I chose to my own field. So making sure that I was opening myself up to other areas. And what the good thing about the long list I found is that other people had chosen completely different books to me. And so that gave me the opportunity to go and look at books that I otherwise wouldn't have chosen and that were well outside my subject area.
Good. Jenny?
Well, this year there weren't that many books in my field, or even really closely related at all. So most of the books I came to fairly fresh. I think there was one that I picked for the long list, which was closest to my field.
Yes. Was that the spider book?
That was the spider book. Yes.
Very educational moment. There's this book which is, we can talk freely about it, in the long list, which most of us, imagine this book which is full of close-up pictures of spiders, all right, in great detail. And I must say, I find great. And then Jenny said, look at this book more carefully. It's a wonderful way of looking at evolutionary science. And we all looked again, which is going to lead to my next subject. And that was a very good example of the way popular science can really take you in, that thing of taking you into an area where you didn't expect to go and carries you along. What about you, Robert, and also the question of rereading, which you brought up?
I mean, certainly from the point of view, my big advantage on this was in the terms of specialist fields, because I don't have a specialist field. In fact, I don't even have a field, let alone a special. So that wasn't a problem for me, but the rereading was the real revelation to me that
some of the books that were on the long list, I got annoyed with and frustrated with, and just went, "Oh, I can't do it." And I was under a lot of pressure, and I was thinking, I want to read the ones I want to read. And and then when you steered me, I was steered by my fellow judges to reread it, and that was an absolute revelation to then reread this book. I don't know how, I don't know what happened psychologically. Some clever person can tell me. But it was a complete turnaround, in my opinion, about it.
Yes.
And instead of finding it annoying and, I just absolutely loved it and couldn't put it down. So that was a joy. And the joy for me was once we got to the shortlist, I was so thrilled I was doing it, because there was a chore element, without a question. There was a big pile of books next to my favourite sofa, and they were just looking at me all day. It's very difficult.
The rereading, again, I think very characteristic perhaps of this prize, is that the rereading process, very, very important. And by the long list, it became really thrilling, I think. Now listen, I think we could go on for long, but it's all about the short list. This is a time we clear out. Robert, the media star, is going to do the introductions. And don't be nervous, shortlist writers, because, it's wonderful that you're here. Okay, and this is quite something, I think. So be proud. Okay, we're away. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you. So we're going to start with the list, Alex's Adventures in Numberland, written by Alex Bellos. Now, this book was chosen for the shortlist because it's a complete revelation. It's a rich and diverse story of mathematics. It's peppered with anecdotes and personalities, whirling around the globe and through history. It's an amazing book, and it brings maths bursting to life in a way that we really didn't expect. So, Alex Bellos, please come to the stage, please.
Good evening. This is a short excerpt from my chapter on pi. Pi, which is 3.14, ... as everyone I'm sure knows. Pi's mathematical properties have made it a celebrity among numbers, and also a more general cultural icon. Because pi's digits never repeat, they are perfect for feats of memorization. If remembering numbers is your thing, the ne plus ultra of digits is the digits in pi. And this has been a pastime since at least 1838, when the Scotsman reported that a 12-year-old Dutch boy recited all the 155 digits that were known at the time to an audience of scientists and royals. Akira Haraguchi, a 60-year-old retired engineer, holds the current world record. In 2006, he was filmed in a public hall near Tokyo reciting pi to 100,000 decimal places. The performance took him 16 hours and 28 minutes, including 5-minute breaks every 2 hours to eat rice balls. He explained to a journalist that pi symbolized life, since its digits never repeated and followed no pattern. Memorizing pi, he added, was the religion of the universe. Now, pi memorization gets a little dull, but pi memorization while juggling, now there's a competitive sport. The record is held by Mats Bergsten, an actuary in Sweden in his late 50s, who has recited 9,778 digits while juggling with 3 balls. He told me, however, that he is proudest of his achievements in the Everest test, in which the first 10,000 digits of pi's expansion are divided into 2,000 groups of 5, beginning with 14159. In the test, 50 groups are randomly read out, and the contestant has to say from memory which 5 numbers precede and succeed each of them. Mats Bergsten is one of only 4 people in the world who can do this with no errors, and his time, 17 minutes and 39 seconds, is the fastest. It is much more mentally straining, he told me, to recall 10,000 digits randomly than merely remembering them in order. When Akira Haraguchi recited 100,000 digits of pi by heart, he used a mnemonic technique, assigning syllables to each number from 0 to 9, and then translating pi's decimals into words, which in turn formed sentences. The first 15 digits sounded like, "The wife and children have gone abroad. The husband is not scared." Using words to remember the digits in pi this way is used by school children in cultures all over the world. But usually this is done not by assigning syllables, but by creating a phrase in which the number of letters in each word represents each consecutive digit in the decimal expansion. A well-known English one is credited to the astrophysicist Sir James Jeans, "How I Need a Drink, Alcoholic in Nature, after the heavy lectures involving quantum mechanics. All of thy geometry, Herr Planck, is fairly hard. How has 3 letters, I has 1, need has 4, and so on." Among numbers, only pi has inspired this type of fandom. No one wants to memorize the square root of 2, which is just as challenging. Pi is also the only number to have inspired its own literary subgenre. Constrained writing is a technique in which some condition is adopted that imposes a pattern or forbids certain things in the text. Entire poems, or poems, have been written under the constraint that the number of letters per word is determined by pi, usually with the convention that a 0 in the expansion requires a 10-letter word. The most ambitious poem is the Cadet Cadenza by Mike Keith, which follows pi for 3,835 digits. It begins as a pastiche of Edgar Allan Poe. 1, a poem. A raven, midnight so dreary, tired and weary, silently pondering volumes extolling all by now obsolete lore. During my rather long nap, the weirdest tap, an ominous vibrating sound disturbing my chamber's antedoor. This, I whispered quietly, I ignore. Keith says that writing with a difficult constraint is an exercise both in discipline and discovery. Since the digits in pi are random, the constraint is, he said, like bringing order out of chaos. When I asked him, why pi? He replied that pi was a metaphor for all things infinite, or inscrutable, or unpredictable, or full of endless wonder. Thank you.
Our next book is Through the Language Glass, How Words Colour Our World, written by Guy Deutscher. This book was chosen for the shortlist because it is an enthralling book that truly broadened our understanding of language, of culture and of science of perception, using startling experiments to make us rethink the subtle assumptions with which we view and describe the material world. So please welcome onto the stage Guy Deutscher.
Thank you very much. The easiest way to tell you, to give you a taste of what my book is about would have been to read an excerpt from the beginning of the book, because surprisingly enough, that's where I try to explain what the book is about. But the organizers assured us that the first chapters of all 6 books have been available on the website of the Royal Society, and so clearly everyone here has read them and knows them all off by heart, and therefore I will read something else, even if it doesn't tell you what the book is about. But just in a few words, my book has 2 main parts. The first is primarily historical. The second primarily deals with modern, sort of cutting-edge research. And the section I want to read now is the beginning of the first part, the historical part, and it describes, I suppose, the event that really sparked off the debates about the questions that are discussed about in the book, about the relation between language and thought and perception, and the possible influence of our language on our thoughts and perceptions. London, 1858. On the 1st of July, the Linnean Society, in its magnificent new quarters at Burlington House in Piccadilly, will hear 2 papers by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace announcing jointly a theory of evolution by natural selection. Before long, the flame will flare up and illuminate the intellectual firmament, leaving no corner of human reason untouched. But although the wildfire of Darwinism will catch up with us soon enough, we do not begin quite there. Our story starts a few months earlier and a few streets away, in Westminster, with a rather improbable hero. At 49, he is already an eminent politician, Member of Parliament for Oxford University, and ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer. But he's still 10 years away from first becoming Prime Minister, and even further from being celebrated as one of Britain's greatest statesmen. In fact, the Right Honourable William Ewart Gladstone has been languishing on the opposition benches for the last 3 years. But his time has not been idly spent. While out of office, he has devoted his legendary energies to the realm of the mind, and in particular to his burning intellectual passion. That ancient bard who, in his words, founded for the race the sublime office of the poet, and who built upon his own foundations an edifice so lofty and so firm that it still towers unapproachably above the handiwork not only of common, but even of many uncommon men. Homer's epics are for Gladstone nothing less than the most extraordinary phenomenon in the whole history of human culture. The Iliad and the Odyssey have been his lifelong companions and his literary refuge ever since his school days. But for Gladstone, a man of deep religious conviction, Homer's poems are more than merely literature. They are his second Bible, a perfect compendium of human character and experience that displays human nature in the most admirable form it could assume without the aid of Christian revelation. Gladstone's monumental oeuvre, his studies on Homer and the Homeric age, has just been published this March. Its 3 stout, door-stopping tomes of well over 1,700 pages sweep across an encyclopedic range of topics, from the geography of the Odyssey to Homer's sense of beauty, from the position of women in Homeric society to the moral character of Helen. One unassuming chapter, tucked away at the end of the last volume, is devoted to a curious and seemingly marginal theme: Homer's perception and use of color. Gladstone's scrutiny of the Iliad and the Odyssey revealed that there is something awry about Homer's description of color. And the conclusions Gladstone draws from his discovery are so radical and so bewildering that his contemporaries are entirely unable to digest them and largely dismiss them out of hand. But before long, Gladstone's conundrum will launch 1,000 ships of learning, have profound effect on the development of at least 3 academic disciplines, and trigger a war over the control of language between nature and culture that after 150 years shows no sign of abating. I'm skipping a tiny bit here. For someone used to the doldrums and ditchwater of latter-day academic writing, reading Gladstone's chapter on colour comes as rather a shock, that of meeting an extraordinary mind. One is left in awe by the originality, the daring, the razor-sharp analysis, and that breathless feeling that however fast one is trying to run through the argument in one's own mind, Gladstone is always 2 steps ahead. And whatever objection one tries to raise, he has preempted several pages before one has even thought of it. It is therefore all the more startling that Gladstone's tour de force comes to such a strange conclusion. To phrase it somewhat anachronistically, he argued that Homer and all his contemporaries perceived the world in something closer to black and white than to full technicolor. Thank you.
The next book is The Disappearing Spoon by Sam Kean. Now, this book was chosen for the shortlist because it is so much more than just a witty guide to the periodic table. It gives a fascinating insight into the history of the elements, how they were discovered, and the extraordinary part they play in our lives. So please welcome onto the stage Sam Kean.
Well, hello. So the premise of The Disappearing Spoon was to find a funny or an unusual or bizarre, spooky story about every single element on the periodic table. And all 118 of them are in there. But I wanted to really highlight that the elements aren't just about science. There's really a lot more to the periodic table. And it really spins out into a lot of different areas of our life. There are chapters about poison and war and a lot of different things. And the section I'm going to read tonight is about one of the big personalities who contributed a lot to the periodic table. But he's not a very well-known person, so I wanted to bring him out a little bit. His name was George Hevesy. In 1910, George Hevesy arrived in England to study radioactivity. His university's lab director in Manchester, Ernest Rutherford, FRS, immediately assigned Hevesy the Herculean task of separating out radioactive atoms from non-radioactive atoms inside blocks of lead. And actually, it turned out to be not Herculean, but impossible. Rutherford and everyone else at the time assumed that the radioactive atoms, which they called radium-D, were a unique substance. In fact, radium-D was just radioactive lead, and therefore it could not be separated out chemically. Ignorant of this, Hevesy wasted 2 years tediously trying to tease lead and radium-D apart before finally giving up. Hevesy, a bald, droopy-cheeked, mustached aristocrat from Hungary, was also facing some domestic frustrations. Hevesy was far from home and used to savory Hungarian food, and found the cooking at his boarding house not to his taste. Plus, after noticing patterns in the meals served there, Hevesy grew suspicious that, like a high school cafeteria recycling Monday's hamburgers into Thursday's beef chili, that his landlady's fresh daily meat was anything but fresh. When confronted, she denied this. So Hevesy decided to seek proof. Miraculously, he'd achieved a breakthrough in lab around that time as well. He still couldn't separate the radium-D out, but he realized he could maybe flip that to his advantage. He'd begun using the possibility of injecting minute quantities of dissolved lead into a living creature. He could then trace the element's path, since the creature would metabolize the radioactive and the non-radioactive lead in the same way. And the radium-D would then emit little beacons of radioactivity as it moved throughout the body. If this worked, he could actually track molecules inside veins and organs, an unprecedented degree of resolution. Before he tried this on a living being, though, Hevesy decided to test his idea on the tissue of a non-living being, a test with an ulterior motive. He took too much meat at dinner one night, and when the landlady's back was turned, sprinkled hot powdered radioactive lead over it. She gathered his leftovers as normal, and the next day, Hevesy brought home a newfangled radiation detector from his lab buddy, Hans Geiger. Sure enough, when he waved it over that night's goulash, Geiger's counter went furious. Click, 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 click. Hevesy confronted his landlady with the evidence. But being a scientific romantic, Hevesy no doubt laid it on a little thick as he explained the mysteries of radioactivity. In fact, the landlady was so charmed to be caught so cleverly with the latest tools of science that she didn't even get mad. There's no historical record of whether she altered her menu, however. No. Thank you.
Next, we have The Wave Watcher's Companion, written by Gavin Preta-Pinney. The book was chosen because it is a brilliant, almost poetic book that really opened our eyes. We were amazed to find that we now see waves everywhere we look, making the world around us more absorbing and enchanting place, thanks to modern science. So please welcome onto the stage Gavin Preta-Pinney.
Thanks very much. It's wonderful to be here. So the book is, if you read just the first chapter, you might get the impression that it's just about ocean waves, but it's not at all. It's about all the waves that surround us. And ocean waves are only actually a tiny proportion of the many waves that surround us, light waves, sound waves, radio waves, and even the waves that are formed within us. Every beat of your heart takes the form of a muscular wave. Even the movement of information around our brain seems to be associated with waves of neuronal activity on the cortex. And when you stop to look at them and you start looking them around, you realize that our every experience is mediated by waves. Every sound you hear, every melody you enjoy, every film you watch, every science book you read, every newspaper, every facial expression you read reaches you via waves. They're energy moving from one place to another, and they're the go-betweens. And they're seen and they're felt all around us, but the fact that they're waves is rarely noticed. But the sort of wave I'm going to read about in this little excerpt is not one of energy moving from one place to another, but of information traveling through a group of individuals. It's like a Mexican wave traveling around a stadium of people. When to jump up. The information of when to jump up is what travels. Bees do another example. Honeybees in Asia do an example of this, where they flick their abdomens in a kind of rippling fashion to expel hornets, predatory hornets, and confuse them. Waves passing through a group of individuals can also increase the chances of survival when food is scarce. At least they can for a certain rather remarkable type of amoeba called Dictyostelium discoideum. This is a microorganism that lives in the soil of deciduous woodlands and feeds on the bacteria among the decaying leaves. It's described as a social amoeba because of the way individual organisms get together when times are hard. Normally, when there's plenty of bacteria around for them to eat, they keep themselves to themselves, feeding, replicating, hanging out as individuals. In this solitary mode, they behave no different from normal antisocial amoeba. They don't stop to chat, never call each other, just mind their own business. Only when the supply of bacteria runs out and the microscopic organisms are faced with starvation do they finally start to get to know each other. In fact, they go from one extreme to the other. Some of the cells release a chemical signal which has a magnetic effect on the neighboring cells. It causes them to move towards the source and at the same time release some of the chemical themselves. In this way, the message to gather passes through the Dictyostelium population in the form of waves of chemical signal and gathering movement. When a lawn of these amoebae, starved of food in a petri dish in a lab, is filmed in time-lapse, these waves of movement appear as dark bands that spread in spirals over the population. Though the individual cells are far too small to be seen by the naked eye, they're only about 10,000th of a millimeter long. The surface of the lawn darkens when the cells are moving on account of them stretching out to do so. The appearance of these tiny, rippling bands of light and dark is quite beautiful. But what happens when the Dictyostelium get together is less so. Within a matter of hours, after 20 to 30 waves, the amoebae have congregated into lumps of up to 100,000 cells called slugs. Each slug looks like a tiny blob of Vaseline, just a couple of millimeters long. It bears no relation to the actual larger slugs you see in the garden, which are individual animals of the mollusk family. Nevertheless, like their namesakes, these blobby collections of amoebae secrete a slimy substance that coats and protects them as a whole and helps them to move as one. For the wave-like coordination of the amoebae doesn't stop once they've gathered together. Similar waves of chemical release and movement seem to travel through the population within the slug, coordinating them to propel the slug along as if it were now a single organism. The amoebae in the main body of the slug move forward and backwards to form longitudinal pulses that inch it along. Those amoebae at the slug's front tip, which is lifted off the ground, move in a spiral wave, rather like a corkscrew, to ensure that the pulses set off down the slug's length in a coordinated fashion. Like some 100,000 strong pantomime horse, this slug slithers off in search of a better life, leaving a tiny trail of slime behind it. When it finds somewhere lighter and warmer, it proceeds to rise like a fungus from the ground and form a fruiting body at its tip. A fifth of the population, the ones that drew the short straw and ended up as the stalk, now give their lives for the greater good. Having lifted the rest of the dictyostelium up and up to a towering 3 millimeters into the sky, the lucky ones at the top change into spores to be dispersed in the wind. When these find themselves in the presence of yummy bacteria once again, they germinate to form more amoebae, and so as antisocial as ever. The amoebae set about feeding and multiplying once more. They pass each other with barely a nod or hello. That is, until the food runs out again, the waves return, and the whole cycle rolls on. Thank you.
Our next book is Massive, The Missing Particle That Sparked the Greatest Hunt in Science, written by Ian Sample. Now, this book was chosen because it is an extraordinary book that tells the very real human story behind one of the biggest science adventures of our time, managing to translate the complex concepts of particle physics into a real page-turner. So please welcome onto stage Ian Sample.
Sorry, excuse me. God. I'd like to confirm the chairman's earlier comment about how utterly unappealing it is to do this kind of thing. Especially when you've just got off a plane and you haven't slept or eaten very much. So sorry if I keel over. Perhaps Sir Paul, you could pick me up and we'll carry back on. Anyway, let's hope that doesn't happen. I've just picked out 3 very short pieces from the book. And I don't know why I've chosen the ones I have. I'm hoping that might make sense later when I've slept. But I was kind of hoping, I suppose, to touch on a few things. One being, I wanted to give you a sense of what it's like for some people in the scientific community, the physics community in this case, particle physics community. My book is about a hunt for a particle that may not even exist. And the first piece is very short. The second piece, I really like the idea of it because it's a big idea, and what I like about things you get in science are the big ideas that really make you think, wow, and would have probably made me go into physics if I'd been clever enough. The second thing is just, the third piece I'll do is just a very short piece to give you some insight into the main character of the book. It's a guy called Peter Higgs, who's, it may help for the intro of this piece actually to realize is an octogenarian, but was one of 6 key people to develop this theory in the 1960s. So, first piece, very short. Peter Higgs is taking a paddle in the sea and giving a double thumbs up to the camera, wearing nothing but a light green mankini, an eye-watering garment that resembles a thong with shoulder straps. Sun glints off the water behind him, and the chrome and glass fittings of millionaires' yachts sparkle as they bob about in the background. It's profoundly inappropriate, says John Ellis, edging past me, and the giant photoshopped image that is propped against the wall of his office and all too realistically melds the head of Peter Higgs with the body of Borat, a character from Kazakhstan created by the television comedian Sacha Baron Cohen. Borat was the theme of our Christmas review some time ago, Ellis says, by way of explanation. A student of mine made it. He's incredibly good at that sort of thing. Ellis's desk at CERN is somewhere beneath piles of research papers that dominate the far corner of his office. Realizing neither of us would see the other if we talked across it, he pulls a couple of chairs into the middle of the room and sits down. Ellis is one of the most prolific and wide-ranging theoretical physicists in the world, having authored nearly 900 scientific articles. He told physicists how to find the gluon, the particle that transmits the strong force. He suggested the lightest particle predicted by supersymmetry was part of the curious dark matter, the invisible cosmic substance that makes up 25% of the mass of the universe. and he showed scientists the best way to search for the Higgs particle. Ellis, who has more than a passing resemblance to Tolkien's congenial wizard Gandalf, was a student at Cambridge University for the last of Paul Dirac's lectures on quantum theory in the 1960s. Came to CERN in 1973. Ellis worked in an office down the corridor when he started the hunt for the Higgs particle in the most tentative way in 1976. That year, he and fellow theorists Mary Gaillard and Dimitri Nanopoulos published the first detailed profile of the Higgs boson and how it was likely to reveal itself in particle collider experiments. Very few people cared about the Higgs boson in those days, Ellis said. I never thought about how long it might take to find. Now, there's something I'll just add about the paper that John Ellis wrote in 1976. At the end of the paper, this was the first paper to do the kind of Photoshop sort of mugshot of what the Higgs should look like in an experiment. At the end of that paper, and it was a phenomenally long paper, he said physicists shouldn't go out of their way to build huge machines to look for the Higgs. He thought you may as well just know what it will look like so you can see it if it happens to pop up somewhere else. Anyway, the next bit I wanted to go through is just a quick bit about an idea that I came across chatting to a theorist at CERN called James Wells. Now, James Wells had one of those ideas that I really like when you first hear it. He was saying to me that particle physics over history, and for understandable reasons, has been incredibly anthropocentric, too anthropocentric. And by that he meant that all of the particles that they look at, these guys, they're either in us or they affect us. They're always the ones that, I don't need to say why the reasons are for that sort of historical progression, but it's probably quite obvious. But particle physics did start out with an anthropocentric sort of focus. And he's saying, well, why on earth, what's so special about us? And what I like about that is we've learned quite a lot through science that there isn't, well, there are many things that are special about us, that we're not often quite so special as we feel. And our perspective may not be as special as we would like it to be. And Wells has this idea that you may have heard of dark matter, with there being a lot of mass in the universe that we can only infer its presence. He goes further than that. He talks about hidden worlds. He talks about there being much more out there than we know. So let me just zip through this. A hidden world might be made up of different kinds of dark particles and forces that are similar to those in our world but don't interact with the matter we know. There could even be a dark version of the standard model. This is the set of equations that explain all the particles and forces that we do know. If that were the case, what is to stop dark stars being born and collapsing at the end of their lives, or dark planets coalescing from dark cosmic detritus? Might there even be some form of dark life? Now, there's a theorist at Oxford called John March Russell who I talked to about this, and he said, we don't have any evidence, but it's something we cannot rule out. There's no reason to think that a hidden world would be any less complex than the world we know. It could have just as rich a set of phenomena. Just as the Copernican revolution told us that the Earth isn't special, the same could be true for everything that we've discovered so far. All of this stuff around us, the stuff of our reality, is it the dominant and most complex part of the universe? It might not be. If hidden worlds are out there, the Higgs particle may be our best chance of finding them. And here's why. Some physicists believe that our own Higgs field will be tenuously linked to other Higgs fields that give mass to particles in the hidden world. The link forms a bridge that provides a way to peer into the hidden world and look at the kinds of particles from which it is made. The Higgs field is unique in being able to do this for several reasons. One crucial feature that sets the Higgs field apart from all others is that it's a scalar field. This means that only the Higgs field looks the same from every direction. A second feature is that the Higgs field, and so its associated particle, permeates all of space. These two features make the Higgs field incredibly sensitive to tiny fluctuations in energy that might ripple over from the hidden world. If the Higgs particle is found at the LHC, physicists believe that its death throes could shine light into hidden worlds. The Higgs particle is highly unstable and is expected to decay into other particles almost as soon as it is created. If hidden worlds exist, the Higgs boson could decay into invisible hidden world particles. These might then break down into real particles that we can see. The effect would show up in the LHC's detectors as a sudden burst of particle tracks that seem to come from nowhere. Spotting tracks like this would allow scientists to work backwards and build up an idea of the kinds of hidden world particles the Higgs boson may have decayed into. The idea of hidden worlds might sound as though it belongs to the ranks of crank ideas that physicians dream up in their spare time, that physicists dream up in their spare time, but the prospect is being taken seriously. It's a quote from James Wells, who I said sort of talked to me about this idea the first time. He says, "If we can use the Higgs boson as a bridge to hidden worlds, it would be one of the most important insights we have had into space and time in the history of science." And physicists aren't, well, some physicists are good at PR. A lot of them aren't. I don't think Wells is over the top. And this is just a very final bit I'm just going to read about, a little bit about Peter Higgs, who's the main guy, because there's an awful lot of misperception about the guy. And it's just really the story about how I got on to talking to him. A handwritten letter landed on my desk at the former offices of the Guardian newspaper in Clerkenwell in central London in June 2007. The stamp showed an image of the Saturn Nebula, an ethereal swirl of blues and reds, set against a jet-black background. I flipped the letter over and spotted an address label for the sender. It was from Peter Higgs. I'd all but given up hope. Months earlier, I'd pitched an idea for an article about Higgs to the Guardian's weekend magazine. At the time, work on the LHC was nearing completion, and much of the PR around the machine mentioned the Higgs boson, or sadly in more journalistic circles, the God particle, which was sold as the secret to understanding the origin of mass. The idea was baffling to me, and Higgs was widely considered a recluse. I thought we had to write about it. I knew Peter Higgs was retired from Edinburgh University, but still held a post as Professor Emeritus. I called the physics department, I contacted the press office, and I sent emails to his colleagues asking if I might arrange a visit. All came to nothing. Eventually, I dug out a copy of Who's Who, found a home address, and wrote to Higgs directly. His reply arrived 6 weeks later. A few more letters and a train journey later, I was standing outside an elegant Georgian terrace beside a leafy park in Edinburgh's Newtown. Around the corner is India Street, where James Clerk Maxwell was born in 1831. I ring the bell, and Higgs buzzes me up and greets me with a grin from the door of his apartment on the top floor. Higgs's apartment is a monument to 1970s styling, complete with retro chairs, lamps, and wall units. The shelves are crammed with art books and copies of Gramophone magazine. Piles of Scientific American, Physics World, and Private Eye cover the coffee table. Against one wall of his living room is a vintage Leak hi-fi system. One thing was clear from the moment we got chatting. Higgs's reputation for being a reclusive genius is as flawed as any convenient stereotype. He's retired, but still extraordinarily busy. All kinds of print and broadcast media from around the world bombard him with requests for interviews. Many fall by the wayside or go so long without a reply that people on deadlines miss their chance. He's gone on the defensive so far as answering the phone goes and tends to answer only when he knows who is calling and when. I don't have a mobile phone, but I shall probably be bullied into getting one by my sons on the grounds that at my age, I ought to be able to communicate easily, he says. Even if I don't want to receive messages on it, I should be able to send a message saying, "Help, I'm lying on the floor, paralyzed." Higgs avoids computers and email, though this is a hangover from his grim experience of using old-fashioned computers during his student days. There was a stage at the time he was finishing his PhD when research students spent their nights waiting for calculations to be done. I probably take my reaction to extremes in not getting involved with modern computing, he says. Higgs is not entirely happy with the way CERN's LHC collider and the doomed American SSC collider before it were publicized as Higgs hunting machines. There is an obvious danger that if the particle is not discovered, people will ask whether these enormous multi-billion-dollar machines are a waste of time and money. The LHC will look for evidence of deeply profound ideas, such as supersymmetry and extra dimensions. Not only the Higgs particle, he explains. The way it is sometimes publicized is a bit insulting to the intelligence of the public, he says. As we sit chatting, Higgs tells the story of how he stumbled on something in the nothingness of space that gives mass to particles. It has consequences, he says, folding his arms so that each hand can rub the opposite elbow. If it wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. His money is on scientists finding more than one Higgs particle, with luck, a whole set of them that are described by supersymmetry. The annual festival that had attracted Higgs to Edinburgh in 1949 was in full swing the day I first visited him. Higgs had plans for the evening, and we were rapidly running out of time. While he got ready for an evening of Monteverdi madrigals, I made my way to the door. On the way out, I asked him whether it was important for him to see scientists discover the particle. "It'll be a relief," he said. "It's been a long journey." That's it.
And finally, we have The Rough Guide to the Future, written by John Turney. Now, this book was chosen because it was a thought-provoking and refreshingly optimistic view of the future across the whole range of sciences, with a highly original style of brief and multi-focused presentations that set it apart from conventional scientific writing. So please welcome onto the stage John Turney.
Hello. One of the things that was in my mind when I set out to write this book was that attitudes to the future are quite diverse nowadays, possibly more diverse than in the past. So, as you'd expect, there's a long midsection where I inquire into the headline issues which concern us all about the next 50 to 100 years. But that's topped and tailed with a look at how people have thought about the future in history, and at just how much future there might be, according to cosmologists. When you do that, one thing you find is that old views are not superseded, but they coexist with newer ideas. There was a big change in images of possible futures in the Western world a few hundred years ago. To summarize a complex story rather brutally, which is kind of in the spirit of a rough guide, the switch was from expecting the future of earthly lives to be much like the past to anticipating the possibility of progress. But it wasn't a complete switch. Let me just read you one of the little boxes in which I pick up something on the side from the main text and use it to sort of comment obliquely on the main story of a chapter. And this will be a little less scientific than some of the things we've heard so far this evening. Rapture ready. Modern views of future change are a clear departure from those of the past, but not a clean break. The satisfyingly apocalyptic biblical prophecy of the book of Revelation still has its adherents, and they have no doubt about what is to come. The end of life as we know it on earth, with only the faithful being saved and taken up to heaven. Many believe it will happen soon, and devote themselves to recording the signs. It's hard to say how many people believe in the imminent rapture, though it appears to have a much stronger cultural presence in the US than in other predominantly Christian countries. The Left Behind novel series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, which fictionalizes the rapture, has sold in the millions, but then so has Dan Brown. Those less devoted to Scripture, or who interpret it differently, may find this devotion a tad scary. When Ronald Reagan was president of the US, there was concern that his attitude to nuclear war was influenced by his belief in Armageddon, even though his commitment to the Star Wars defense system indicated that he was quite interested in preserving life on Earth for the time being. Environmentalists have also frequently quoted Secretary of the Interior James Watt, who told, as a good historical name for you, who told a congressional committee in 1981, not going to attempt the accent, "I do not know how many future generations we can count on before the Lord returns." However, Watt was not seriously proposing abandoning the earth to its fate either. After this pious reference to uncertainty about the Lord's timetable, he went on, "Whatever it is, we have to manage with a skill to relieve the resources needed for future generations." Phew. For a less reassuring reading of the state of the world, check out the Rapture Index, which, of course, you can find on the web. It presents a compilation of factors ranging from unemployment levels and interest rates to false Christs and events involving witchcraft that can be used as an indicator of how near we are to the end of life on Earth. The index's creator provides a useful analogy. You could say the Rapture Index is a Dow Jones Industrial Average of end-time activity, but I think it would be better if you viewed it as a prophetic speedometer. The higher the number, the faster we're moving toward the occurrence of pre-tribulation rapture. The handy guide continues with the numbers. Rapture Index of 100 and below, slow prophetic activity. 100 to 130, moderate prophetic activity. 130 to 160, heavy prophetic activity. Above 160, fasten your seatbelts. At the time of writing, the index stood at 167, but the publisher decided to go ahead with this book anyway. So far, it looks as though that was the right call, but I did look up the Rapture Index on the web this morning, and I have to tell you it's now registering 180, so enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thank you very much for all of you. That was very good. I'm just going to ask a question of each of you very briefly now, but starting with you, Alex. You previously written a biography of the football legend Pelé.
Yes.
Which, so, as well as books about Brazil, so how different was it to write a book that focused on mathematics?
Well, obviously the subject is very different, but I actually think that the process was really quite similar. Because when I wrote my book on Brazil, I was a guide to Brazil. I speak Portuguese, so I was the local guide who understood the culture, who went on a journey and reported back. And the same way in maths, I've got a degree in maths, so I understand the language of Numberland. So I was your guide, and I sort of ventured and came back and sort of told people what I found there. So I actually think that the styles of my books are quite similar.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Guy, now, what was it that got you interested in different languages and the way that they interact and the way that they work?
Well, it's been my field for many years. That's my academic speciality. I suppose I've always been interested in languages from when I was a child. Not sure why. What drew me into the particular questions that I address in the book, I suppose, it's a sort of sequel to the previous book I wrote, which tried to explain how this extremely complex, magnificent system of language could have evolved in the first place, and trying to show that a lot of it can sort of emerge of its own accord through sort of normal patterns of communication. And there was an open question that I left at the end of the last book about the differences or why such different systems in different languages emerge in different societies, and to what extent the structure of language is, on one hand, influenced by the type of society and culture that it's spoken in, and vice versa influences it. And then in this book, I tried to, well, maybe not quite solve the problems, but have a much closer look at it, and try to give some plausible answers.
Great, thank you. Sam Keane, we have now your book about the periodic table is for some children in classrooms. You're looking at one. It was an absolute nightmare, the periodic table. So, I mean, what was it that inspired you to kind of try and get people interested in it and to understand it? Because it was a steep learning curve for this particular reader.
That was actually one of the things. It's something everyone. Maybe the only thing everyone remembers from high school chemistry class, but not everyone remembers it very fondly. And I knew that there were a lot of great stories out there about elements that we all thought we knew well, but had an unusual backstory or a funny history to them. And also there were whole just swaths of the periodic table that we never, ever talked about in class, and I was really curious what all those other elements, what was their story? Why don't we ever talk about them? So I wanted to give a personality to the entire periodic table.
Excellent. Good. Now, Gavin, so what were you really inspired to write this book just by standing on a beach watching waves? I mean, what was the original thing that made you go, hang on?
Well, I think previously I did a book about clouds, and there's quite a lot of similarities between the two subjects, actually, funnily enough, in my mind, because what interests me are the things that are so commonplace and so everyday that we don't notice them. The stuff that's around us and that kind of shapes our world, but because we're so used to it being there, we become blind to it. And so for me, waves, well, there's the act of watching waves on the shore, and it's a kind of beautifully relaxing, meditative thing to do, rather like cloud spotting. But there's also the fact that, that once you start looking at ocean waves, you start realizing, well, you have to start talking about all the other waves as well. One leads to another, and you realize that these phenomena pervade every aspect of our lives, and yet largely we're sort of oblivious to them. That's what interested me.
Very good. Now, Ian, how do you explain a concept like the Higgs boson to a non-scientific audience? And how do you write about the ongoing experiments such as the LHC?
I have no idea.
And when you're half asleep. I do feel sorry for you.
I hate it when people do this. Can I say something that I think I just really want to get across, which is, and it might answer that, but I'm not quite sure. One thing, this book happened because scientists, a really obvious point, because scientists spoke to me, and that sounds really silly, but these guys are so, they have something so interesting that they're involved with, and they are so ready to speak to you. And I don't think we can take this. As journalists, this is like our one golden thing, is the access we get to people. And that is not an access that I think we take lightly or take for granted. I mean, the fact that, and there is I'm talking about this now because there is always tension, but I think there's probably raised tension at the moment between scientists and journalists, because journalists, to use the broad brush, always screw things up. And so, but these people told me what they were doing. They told me why they would, in some cases, wreck their lives to pursue what they were working on, shared with me all the information. They told me stories, and for that reason, all of this stuff came to me as I was, as I was working on this just for the newspaper. You suddenly build up an enormous number of different threads of stories, and you think this stuff is, for me, I find it genuinely really fascinating. And it doesn't happen if these guys don't have infectious enthusiasm for what they're talking about. And doesn't answer your question,
no,
does
it does.
at all?
No, yes.
But basically, if someone tells you something that's really fascinating, they tell you in an interesting way, then they've done the work for you.
Yeah. Good. John, now, as this is a rough guide to the future, where is your recommendation for a future travel destination? Where's a good place to go in about 100 years' time?
That rather invokes the spectre of climate change, doesn't it? If I had free choice, I think I'd probably stay here, because it's a nice temperate country and the landscape will change. There's perhaps we had a lot of books tonight. I'll introduce one more into the conversation. There's a fine book published last year by Merrick Cohen called Turned Out Nice, which is a depiction of how the landscapes of different parts of the United Kingdom might change. And I think somewhere in these islands there'll still be pleasant places to make one's home, perhaps less so in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Well, I would very much like to open, if there's anyone in the audience here tonight who has a question for any of the authors, we do have roving microphones, and it would be wonderful if you've got a wonderful, stimulating, challenging question to throw at one of our authors. I bet someone will do it. So if you would raise your hand, we have someone right. Oh, right, no, sorry, so at the back there, well done. The microphones will get to you very soon.
Hello. This is actually a rehash of a question that was asked here last year, but it was a good question then, so hopefully it will be again. Last year it was asked about the titles, whether or not you chose your own titles, whether you were happy with them, and how significant you thought that was. I think it's curious this year that two of the titles make Lewis Carroll allusions. Yes, were you happy with the titles? Alex in particular, actually, because I thought your American title was much better. I think it was Here's Looking at Euclid.
The story of my title is quite funny, and tells us maybe more about the difference between America and Britain than it does about science. So the title that we came up with, Alex's Adventure in Numberland, I then took to my American publisher, and they were like, nah, who's Alex? It's not going to work. So we took us months, and I finally came up with Here's Looking at Euclid, which they loved because it was funny. And then I can remember coming back to some of my English friends and saying, Here's Looking at Euclid. And they're like, that wouldn't work in the UK. Who's Euclid? So I think it's the right title for each country. And not enough people who aren't scientists know who Euclid is. Actually, it's quite shocking. I'm not sure why more people in America know who he is. I think it's my own personal theory is because of the founding fathers and Masons. The Masons are obsessed with Euclid. And so many roads in American towns are named after Euclid, and there's a metro in Brooklyn which is Euclid. So Euclid is just around in America, whereas here, no one knows who Euclid is.
Question here.
I was just going to say, you're all inutterably gorgeous, of course, but where are the girls? Were there many women writers in this amongst your huge
Well,
pile.
it's almost a question for the judge. I mean, there was, yes, but there was we discussed it a great deal, and it was a cause of considerable concern that, you know, the list became more and more male. I mean, would you like to say anything about it? Okay,
well, I have to say that the proportion of women authors was actually quite low. I don't know who I'm talking to, sorry. Surprisingly low and disappointingly low. And then as we went through the long list and then down to the short list, we found it impossible to have women represented. So we were disappointed by that. So I would encourage anyone in the audience, if you've got a writing bug going, especially if you're female, please, next year, competition.
I might add that on the long list, there were 2 women authors.
There were, you're right, yes, on the long list. Wait. We just got a comment on that.
Yeah, sorry, I was in the audience last year and I asked a similar question, which was, why are you guys all? Why are you all white middle class men? And my question was kind of batted back and not answered, because I think maybe the way I put it, maybe that sounds a bit sort of aggressive and judgmental. It's not. It's just what is the answer to that question, and I don't know. I was genuinely hoping to get some answers on that. Why is it? Look at it again. Here we are again. What's all that about? I know there are some obvious things you can say, but there's things that I don't understand about that at all.
Your books will be read in great number, but mostly by people who already have an interest in science. I've been looking at for want of a better word, books that my children are given at school. They're astonishingly badly written. And I was just wondering which of you, if any, have actually decided to apply your talents to people before they decide that they hate chemistry?
Can I just say, this is really about my previous book, but I decide, you know, when you write a book, you usually have your ideal audience or embodiment of your ideal audience. And my embodiment of the ideal audience was myself, age 17. I was trying to answer exactly those questions that bothered me and about language when I was finishing my secondary school. I hope, well, the way I wrote would be accessible for at least bright sixth formers. I didn't try to go lower than that, so to speak, but it certainly was an aim.
I have had teachers tell me that they've used the book, my book, in classrooms, and they were kind of grateful for it because it gave a way to get into the material and kind of grab people's attention. They just found that the kids responded to the stories pretty well, and once they had their attention, they could do a little bit more with it. And I also think people can learn more science than you might think just by hearing and reading stories. I think that's just how the human mind remembers information best in story form. So that's one of the things I did want to get across, but there was maybe another way to get at the material.
Can I just add something as well? I mean, from my point of view, I think what's crucial is curiosity these days, because it's actually very easy to get hold of information, but easier than it's ever been. And so what you need to be encouraging in children is curiosity and kind of engagement in finding out the information. And I think about my daughter, our oldest daughter's only 5.5, but I really spend a lot of time talking to her about what's around us and just trying to get her to ask questions and wonder about the everyday stuff that's around us. And so I think, you know, it really is the crucial thing these days is kind of building up and engendering and drawing out that curiosity.
Very good. Yes, this gentleman.
With reference to your question about the future, you're probably not aware that the Foreign Office has issued a travel advisory and IATA saying, do not fly Red Dwarf. My question now. Obviously, I haven't read the books. The judges have. Maybe it's a judge's question. I don't know. Where in what you seem to have treated fairly sort of existing subjects, if that's the right word. What I'd like to know is a lot of scientific ideas which are thrown out by the establishment may 20, 30 years later prove to be absolutely spot on. And there are a whole range of these. So what I would like to know is, where do you float an idea in such a book, and where do you hold back? I mean, there has to be some level where you say, I'm going to be ridiculed for putting this in, so I won't put it in. Or you dare to challenge maybe something well into the future. I don't know whether that's too vague a question, but it's an issue I'd like to see if anybody could tackle.
I'm just wondering whether you, John, whether you would, I mean, because some of the concepts you were dealing with were sort of very cutting
I think
edge.
it's personal to authors, isn't it? I mean, people can write books of all kinds, as speculative as all get at. My personal view is that sort of protocol for a popular science book is that you should indicate when the ideas you're describing, be they ever so exciting, depart from the current scientific consensus. And you may choose to write a whole book about such ideas, but you should indicate that, you know, if you put these to a committee of boring scientists, they'd all shake their heads and look the other way.
There's a question here.
It feels like quite a good time to be a consumer of popular science, just because there are so many amazing science books out there. But I suspect it must be quite difficult from an author's perspective, because as well as having an original idea, you have to somehow make it distinctive in what seems like quite a crowded field. And I was wondering, how do you go about that process? I suppose, you know, you kind of think of Carl Sagan and thinking he must have had it easy compared to you guys in some ways. Is that something you have to grapple with when you're in the process of writing and picking your ideas?
I can answer that.
Alex, go, yes.
There's not that much stuff written about maths, and in terms of popular science, maybe 1 or 2 books a year. It's not like, say, genetics, with lots of things that are coming out. And my approach was, well, what can I bring to this? So you can only do what you can do. And so I thought, I'm not a mathematician, I'm a journalist, so I need to approach it the way a journalist would. So actually, I think, there are as many different approaches as there are people, actually.
Anyone else want to?
Well, I think that the best motive is to write a book to find out about things you don't yet know about. I mean, if a book already exists that will tell you, then fine. But if you can't quite locate the one, then you're off on a path of inquiry which may sadly entail writing your own.
Are we all right for time? I mean, have we got time for another? Well, is there anyone else? Is anyone else burn? I just don't want to go on too long. But is there anybody else with a burning desire that they need fulfilled? So I'm leaving it as wide open as I possibly can. Looks like all our desires are fully. Oh no, here we have a question. Marvellous, madam.
Thank you. Could any of your books be the basis to turning into a science fiction book?
Or even a cheap science fiction comedy for the...
None of us are that cheap.
I think I have a little science fiction section. I try to do a sort of thought experiment, and it's only about 2 or 3 pages, thinking what would happen if an anthropologist from sort of living in 200 years' time were to beam herself down to the primitive natives in the Silicon Valley, whose way of life hasn't changed a kilobyte since the Google age. And it's in order to sort of demonstrate a certain point, but I use it as a literary method, if you want.
My book was a little too scattered, I think, to spin out into an entire science fiction novel, so I don't know. I'm not sure mine would translate so well to science fiction.
I had I'm really reluctant to bring this up, but I have a chapter in the book looking at end of world scenarios, because an awful lot of problems that arose, really minority problems that get amplified by the press to media to look sort of like that people care about them, was about these big colliders ending the world. And so I took the sort of I took the kind of decision when I started that chapter. It's the kind of decision you take if you don't have a reputation to lose, which is a really lovely position to be in. And I started it with a fictitious, clearly, description of a scenario that a Nobel Prize winner at MIT had talked me through about what might happen in a particular scenario of a collider destroying the world. And it ends with the planet being the size of a hot ball that would fit in Lord's cricket ground and involves crumbling Manhattan. And it's ludicrous, and I wrote it to be intentionally ludicrous so that you think it gives you an air of what some people are complaining about or protesting about. It gives you an air of sort of what kind of thing we're talking about them believing. Kind of not to ridicule it too much, but there's an awful lot of reason that is pure science fiction. It's not based on anything that makes sense. So I'm afraid I made that decision.
I must say that my experience of this was my Twitter stream on, I think, the day that or one of the days that it was announced that it was going to be running, and it became incredibly a philosophical thing about existence. Because people were going, well, we may all not be here now. And maybe we weren't here before they switched it on. Maybe we really are here now, but we weren't before, and that was a dream. And this, this was. I didn't read all of it. It went on a long way. But, I think that's it. So we're now going to, if you wonderful authors, thank you so much. We would like to sit back down, and I will as well, and we'll then have the announcement. Thank you very much. Thank you.
This is the moment we've all been waiting for, but I have to find it. Is this the right envelope? Yes.
I got the money.
But I have the name. You have the money.
Yeah, that's the way I like it.
So, actually, that may define our difference. So this is the moment we've been waiting for. I have to say, none of us, except the jury, know the name in this envelope. I felt the society should have rolling drums at this point. We'll have to think about that. So I'm opening it very carefully. It's folded, so I can't actually see. And the winner of the Royal Society Winton Prize for Science Books for 2011 is The Wave Watcher's Companion by Gavin Pretor Pinney. Gavin.
God, I'm absolutely speechless. I really, literally, am speechless. I had I thought I had no chance of this. Anyway, I'm very, very grateful indeed to members of the jury and to the Royal Society and to Winton as well for this. As I said when we were sitting down there, for me, what's interesting in science is that it's simply something that follows from being curious about the world. And that's really why I was motivated to write this book, why I was motivated to write my previous books, is curiosity. And, I hope it's going to help people look around them a little bit more carefully and be a bit more curious. And I'd just like to say thank you very, very much indeed.
Well, I'm going to bring the proceedings to the end, but I would like to end a special congratulations to Gavin, but also many congratulations to the rest of the shortlist. A wonderful shortlist, and I'd like to thank you all for fantastic contributions to popular science writing. Thank you.